What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a simple chat and ends up walking out in the middle of a live broadcast? It only took one comment from the host to turn a friendly conversation into one of the most shocking moments in talk show history. Samuel L. Jackson had been promoting his latest film when he agreed to appear on the show. The legendary actor, known for his incredible range and powerful performances, walked onto the set with his usual calm confidence. Andy Cohen greeted him with a big smile and a handshake, and everything seemed normal at first. The interview started out well enough. They talked about the new movie, the filming process, and some of the challenges Jackson faced while preparing for the role. Jackson was his usual engaging self, sharing interesting stories from set and making the audience laugh with his natural charisma. Cohen seemed pleased with how things were going, nodding along and smiling at all the right moments. But then something shifted. Cohen leaned back in his chair with a smug expression and decided to change direction. Instead of continuing with the lighthearted conversation about the film, he brought up Jackson's past work in a way that immediately felt off. There was a condescending tone in his voice, a smugness that hadn't been there moments before. "You know, Samuel, I've been watching your movies for years," Cohen said, his voice dripping with false admiration. "But I have to ask, and I think everyone's wondering this, do you ever get tired of playing the same kind of character over and over again?" The audience went quiet. You could feel the tension immediately. Jackson's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He sat up a little straighter, his eyes focused directly on Cohen. "What do you mean by that?" Jackson asked, his voice calm, but with an edge that anyone paying attention would have caught. Cohen waved his hand dismissively, as if the question was no big deal. "Oh, come on, you know what I mean. The tough guy, the angry character, the one who yells a lot. It's kind of your thing, right? Don't you ever want to do something different? Something with more depth?" The implication was clear and insulting. Cohen was suggesting that Jackson, an actor with decades of critically acclaimed performances across every genre imaginable, was somehow one-dimensional. The disrespect was stunning, especially coming from someone who should have known better. Jackson took a breath, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I think if you actually watched my films, you'd know that I've played everything from a drug addict to a superhero, to a classical music lover, to a hitman with a moral code. I've done Shakespeare. I've done comedy. I've done drama. So I'm not really sure what you're trying to say here." His response was measured, professional, and entirely correct. Any reasonable host would have backed off at this point, recognized the misstep, and moved the conversation in a different direction. But Cohen wasn't done. Sure, Cohen said, that same dismissive tone still present. "But let's be honest. When people think of Samuel L. Jackson, they think of you yelling and cursing, right? That's your brand. That's what sells tickets." The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was a host openly disrespecting his guest on live television. Jackson's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "My brand," Jackson said slowly, "is being a professional actor who takes his craft seriously. I've worked with some of the greatest directors in the world. I've been nominated for an Oscar. I've built a career spanning over 40 years. So if you're trying to reduce all of that to some kind of gimmick, then I think we have a fundamental misunderstanding here." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Cohen should have apologized. He should have acknowledged that he'd crossed a line. Instead, he doubled down. "Oh, come on. Don't be so sensitive," Cohen said with a laugh that sounded forced and uncomfortable. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You play the same type of guy in most of your movies. The cool black guy who doesn't take any nonsense. It's not exactly groundbreaking, is it?" The way he said black guy hung in the air like a slap. The racial undertone that had been bubbling beneath the surface was now impossible to ignore. Jackson's expression hardened. The audience gasped. Even Cohen's own production team looked shocked. Jackson sat forward in his chair, his voice low and controlled. Let me tell you something. I've spent my entire career proving that I can do anything. I've played heroes and villains. I've done period pieces and science fiction. I've worked in independent films and massive blockbusters. And you're sitting here, on your show, trying to tell me that my work lacks depth? Cohen shifted in his seat, finally seeming to realize he'd gone too far, but instead of apologizing, he tried to play it off. Hey, I'm just trying to have an honest conversation here. Isn't that what talk shows are for? Real talk? Real talk? Jackson repeated, his voice rising slightly. Real talk would be you doing your homework before bringing a guest on your show. Real talk would be showing some basic respect for someone's body of work. Real talk would be recognizing when you've said something completely out of line. The audience began to murmur in agreement. They were clearly on Jackson's side, and Cohen was starting to look increasingly uncomfortable. But rather than back down gracefully, he made it worse. Look, I think you're overreacting, Cohen said, his voice taking on a patronizing quality that made everything even more insulting. I'm a fan of your work. I'm just asking questions. If you can't handle a little criticism, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. That was it. That was the moment. Jackson stood up from his chair, the movement sudden but controlled. He reached up and removed the microphone from his lapel, his movements deliberate and calm. The audience held their breath. Let me tell you what I can't handle, Jackson said, his voice steady but filled with barely contained anger. I can't handle sitting here while you disrespect me and my career. I can't handle listening to you talk down to me like I'm some kind of amateur who stumbled into success. And I definitely can't handle being on a show where the host thinks it's okay to make thinly veiled racial comments disguised as criticism. Cohen's face went pale. That's not what I was doing at all, he protested weakly. You're completely misunderstanding me. No, Jackson said firmly. I understand you perfectly, and I'm done here. He handed the microphone to one of the stunned producers standing nearby and turned to walk off the set. Cohen, realizing the situation was spiraling completely, out of control, tried one last desperate attempt to salvage things. Samuel, wait, he called out, his voice cracking slightly. Don't leave. We can talk about this. I didn't mean any offense. Jackson paused and turned back, looking Cohen directly in the eye. That's the problem right there. You didn't mean any offense, but you gave it anyway. And you're so caught up in your own ego that you can't even see it. You invited me here to promote my film, and instead, you decided to try and tear down my career for what? For ratings? For some kind of edgy moment? The accuracy of Jackson's words hit like a hammer. Everyone in the studio, from the crew to the audience, could see exactly what had happened. Cohen had tried to create a controversial moment, something that would get people talking, but he'd completely miscalculated. He'd underestimated his guest and overestimated his own position. I have too much respect for myself and for my work to sit here and be insulted, Jackson continued. You want to have real talk? Here's some real talk. You're a host who clearly didn't prepare for this interview. You came in with some preconceived notions about who I am and what I do, and you didn't bother to actually look at the facts. That's lazy. It's disrespectful, and it's beneath what this show should be. Cohen tried to respond, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no words came out. He was completely outmatched, and he knew it. Jackson had dismantled every one of his points with calm precision, and there was nothing left to say. And another thing, Jackson added, his voice getting stronger. When you have a guest on your show, your job is to make them comfortable, to bring out their best stories, to give them a platform to share what they're working on. Your job is not to ambush them with insulting questions designed to make them look bad. That's not being edgy. That's not being provocative. That's just being a bad host. the audience, erupted in applause. They'd been waiting for someone to say what they were all thinking, and Jackson had delivered. Cohen sat frozen in his chair, his face red with embarrassment. He'd completely lost control of his own show, and everyone was witnessing it in real time. Jackson wasn't finished. You know what the really sad part is? I came here today in good faith. I was excited to talk about this film because I'm proud of it. The director is brilliant. The cast worked incredibly hard, and we made something special. But you weren't interested in any of that. You were interested in getting a reaction, in creating drama. Well, congratulations. You got your drama. The weight of his words settled over the studio like a blanket. This wasn't just about one bad interview anymore. This was about respect, professionalism, and the way people treat each other. Jackson had turned what could have been just another celebrity walkout into a masterclass in standing up for yourself with dignity. Cohen finally found his voice, though it came out small and weak. I really didn't mean for things to go this way. I apologize if you felt disrespected. If I felt disrespected? Jackson repeated, shaking his head. That's not an apology. That's you trying to put this back on me, like my feelings are the problem and not your actions. A real apology would be you acknowledging that what you said was wrong, not qualifying it with an if. The lesson in accountability was clear, and it was happening in front of everyone. Cohen squirmed in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with being called out so directly. He'd probably never had a guest confront him like this before, especially not with such clarity and composure. Here's what you don't seem to understand, Jackson continued, his voice taking on an almost teaching quality. When you minimize someone's work, when you try to reduce their entire career to a caricature, you're not being clever. You're being ignorant. And when you do it to someone who has consistently broken barriers and opened doors for others, it's even worse. The truth of his statement resonated through the studio. Jackson had indeed been a trailblazer, someone who had taken on roles that challenged stereotypes and pushed boundaries. To have that reduced to a one-note description was not just inaccurate, it was insulting to everything he'd accomplished. Cohen tried again, his voice desperate now. Look, can we just start over? Forget everything that was just said and begin again? Jackson looked at him with something between pity and disappointment. No, we can't start over. You can't unsay what you said. You can't undo the disrespect. And honestly, I don't think you even understand why what you said was so problematic, which means it would just happen again in a different way. The finality in his voice was unmistakable. This interview was over, and there was no coming back from it. Cohen seemed to realize this too, his shoulders sagging, slightly, as the reality of the situation sank in. You know what the worst part is? Jackson asked, though the question seemed rhetorical. I've been doing this for a long time. I've sat through hundreds of interviews with hosts who were prepared, who asked thoughtful questions, who treated me like a professional. And then I come here, and I get this. It's disappointing. Not just for me, but for your audience who came here expecting a good conversation. He gestured to the audience, many of whom were nodding in agreement. They'd come for entertainment, for insight into one of Hollywood's biggest stars, and instead they'd gotten an uncomfortable confrontation that never should have happened. I hope you learned something from this, Jackson said, his tone softening just slightly. I hope you take some time to think about how you approach your guests, about the responsibility you have when you have a platform like this. Because right now, you're wasting it. With that, Samuel L. Jackson turned and walked off the set. His exit was calm, dignified, and powerful. He didn't storm off in anger. He didn't slam anything or make a scene. He simply removed himself from a situation that had become untenable, and he did it with his head held high. The cameras stayed on Cohen, who sat alone at his desk, looking shell-shocked. The audience was silent now, processing what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't every day that you saw someone stand up for themselves so eloquently, so effectively. Jackson had made his point without raising his voice to a yell, without resorting to insults, and without losing his cool. Cohen fumbled with his note cards, clearly trying to figure out what to do next. His producers were probably screaming in his earpiece, but there was no easy way to recover from this. The show's credibility had taken a massive hit, and it was entirely his fault. "We're going to take a quick break," Cohen finally managed to say, his voice shaky, but everyone knew that no commercial break could fix what had just happened. The damage was done, and it was severe. The whole thing had unfolded in a matter of minutes, but the impact would last much longer. Jackson had walked into that studio as a guest, ready to promote his film and have a pleasant conversation. Instead, he'd been forced to defend his entire career against baseless criticism from a host who clearly hadn't done his homework. What made Jackson's response so powerful was not just what he said, but how he said it. He didn't yell. He didn't curse, despite what Cohen had suggested was his trademark. He didn't lose control. Instead, he calmly and methodically took apart every one of Cohen's arguments, exposing them for the shallow, disrespectful comments they were. The audience had watched a masterclass in maintaining dignity under pressure. They'd seen someone refuse to accept disrespect, even when it would have been easier to just laugh it off or play along. Jackson had drawn a line and stood by it, and in doing so, he'd earned even more respect than he'd walked in with. Cohen, on the other hand, had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of host Jackson had accused him of being: unprepared, disrespectful, and more interested in creating controversy than in having genuine conversations. His attempts to walk back his comments, to minimize the offense, had only made things worse. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark. Jackson, the seasoned professional who knew his worth and refused to be diminished. Cohen, the host who thought he could get away with cheap shots and was stunned when his guest refused to play along. It was a confrontation that never should have happened, but once it did, there was only ever going to be one outcome. As Jackson left the building, he did so knowing he'd stood up not just for himself, but for every actor, every artist, every professional who had ever been disrespected or underestimated. His walkout wasn't a tantrum or a diva moment. It was a principled stand, a refusal to accept treatment that was beneath his dignity. Back in the studio, Cohen would have to face the consequences of his actions. The interview that was supposed to be a fun, promotional chat had turned into a public humiliation, and it was entirely of his own making. He'd underestimated his guest, overestimated his own cleverness, and paid the price for both. The incident served as a reminder that respect is not optional, especially when you have someone as accomplished as Samuel L. Jackson sitting across from you. It showed that preparation matters, that words have consequences, and that sometimes the best response to disrespect is to simply walk away. Jackson's exit was clean, final, and utterly devastating to Cohen's credibility. There would be no second chances, no do-overs, no opportunities to make it right. The moment Cohen decided to belittle his guest's career, he sealed the fate of the interview. Everything that followed was simply Jackson refusing to accept that treatment and removing himself from the situation. The power dynamics had been clear from the start. Cohen thought that as the host, he had control. He thought he could steer the conversation wherever he wanted, even if that meant making his guest uncomfortable. What he failed to realize was that Jackson held all the real power. He was the draw. He was the reason people were watching. And when he decided he'd had enough, there was nothing Cohen could do to stop him. The audience understood this immediately. Their applause for Jackson and their silence for Cohen spoke volumes about whose side they were on. They'd watched someone they admired being disrespected, and they'd seen him handle it with grace and strength. It was the kind of moment that people would talk about for a long time. For Jackson, the decision to leave was probably an easy one once Cohen refused to back down. Why should he sit there and be insulted? Why should he Subject himself to a host who clearly had no respect for his work? The answer was simple. He shouldn't, and he didn't. The walkout was the culmination of every misstep Cohen had made during the interview. The dismissive comments about Jackson's range as an actor. The suggestion that his success was based on a gimmick rather than talent. The patronizing tone when Jackson tried to defend himself. The refusal to offer a genuine apology. Each of these moments had added fuel to the fire, and Jackson had finally decided he'd had enough. What made the whole situation even more compelling was Jackson's composure throughout. Even as he was being insulted, even as he was defending his career, he never lost his cool. He stated his case clearly and firmly, but he didn't resort to the kind of behavior Cohen had tried to stereotype him with. It was a powerful rebuttal in itself. Cohen's attempts to downplay the situation, to act like Jackson was being too sensitive, only highlighted how out of touch he was. He'd created the problem with his disrespectful questions, but he wanted to blame Jackson for the fallout. It was a classic case of someone refusing to take responsibility for their actions. The impact of Jackson's words hung in the air long after he'd left. His points about preparation, respect, and professionalism were not just relevant to this one interview. They were lessons that applied to any interaction where one person has power over another. The host has a responsibility to their guest. The interviewer has a responsibility to do their research. And everyone has a responsibility to treat others with basic dignity. Cohen had failed on all counts, and Jackson had called him out on it in front of everyone. There was no hiding from it, no spinning it into something else. The truth of what had happened was plain for everyone to see. As the show tried to regroup after the break, the absence of Jackson was palpable. The energy had completely shifted. What should have been one of the highlights of the episode had turned into its biggest disaster. And it was all because Cohen had decided to try and tear down his guest instead of building them up. The lesson was clear. Respect matters. Preparation matters. And when you disrespect someone as accomplished and respected as Samuel L. Jackson, don't be surprised when they refuse to stick around for more of the same treatment. Jackson's exit was the perfect ending to a disastrous interview. It was decisive, it was justified, and it left no room for doubt about who was in the wrong. Cohen had created the mess, and Jackson had simply refused to sit in it any longer. The whole incident proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. Jackson didn't need to win an argument or get the last word, though he certainly had both. He just needed to make it clear that he wouldn't tolerate being disrespected, and his walkout did exactly that. It was a moment of pure conviction, of someone knowing their worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. And it was a reminder that even in entertainment, even in the world of talk shows and publicity tours, there are lines that shouldn't be crossed. Cohen had crossed those lines repeatedly, and Jackson had shown him exactly what happens when you do.